Good evening. Welcome to the Livonia Public Schools Board of Education Committee of the Whole meeting of December 6th, 2021. We are going to start with audience communications. I do not have any blue slips. Is there anybody present who wishes to address the board during audience communications this evening? Seeing none, we will go on to our next item of Committee of the Whole. This time, I would like to recognize, there is no adequate way for us to do so, but I would like to recognize our fellow community members in Oxford and our fellow education community members in all of our region that are truly suffering at this time. There is, as I said, there is no adequate way for us to express our sorrow and our grief other than to say that we are all walking through this together. That includes many in our own Livonia community who are suffering along with our friends and our education folks in Oxford. And our thoughts and our prayers are with this entire region as we grapple with this situation. I do not have another item under Committee of the Whole. Mrs. Oakwist, do you have anything you'd like to add to Committee of the Whole this evening?
Well, I know, President Burton, when we spoke earlier today, you had mentioned that if we wanted to highlight just a few messages from this past week as the district has responded to the events, the tragic events in Oxford, and just some of the response of the district as we move forward. If you'd like me to do that now, I'm
Absolutely.
happy to do that.
Please
So I'll share in broad terms now because I know we've shared some of this in our communications. I just want to echo President Burton's words. Schools, without question, should be safe havens for children every single day. They should not have to worry about this. Their parents should not have to worry about this. And certainly our staff should not have to worry about this. And yet we know it is an unfortunate reality that we've seen happen. One of the things that prior incidents across the nation have caused us to do is to continuously reflect and refine our practices as it relates to emergency preparedness, crisis management, and the elements that we have in place in Livonia Public Schools. And so one of the things we've tried to do in our communications to our community, our parents, and our staff, we sent out one on Tuesday evening, Thursday evening, and Sunday evening. And in each of those, I really sought to highlight some of those elements that are in place, that we have emergency crisis response plans for our district. We have an emergency operation plan that if you recall, our board went through in great detail over the past couple of years that had to be approved by the police department as well as by the state. That is a state requirement. Each of our schools are required to conduct annual safety drills. Those are lockdown drills, fire drills, tornado drills, and there are various requirements for how often you have to do that, certifying that those have been done. In addition to that, I'm very proud of the commitment that this board has made over several years with regard to personnel, because there is not one item that you can buy that will ultimately make the difference. People are an important element of this, and as you know, we have an administrator of security in the district. We have 3 school resource officers paid for out of the district's budget that service each triad, but that are housed at the high schools. We have security personnel in the form of blue line officers across our middle and high schools, and respond to needs at our other schools as necessary. That personnel, in addition to highly trained and just very experienced administrators, staff, mental health providers, that combination of people is one of the most important elements because, again, foundationally to our work within our schools starts with the relationships we build, 1, with our students, 2, with our parent community, and 3, amongst all of the adults, staff to staff, staff to parents, staff to students. And that piece is an essential element of our work. And so that, in combination with certainly some of the security enhancements we've been able to do at our facilities, whether it's the secure vestibules, the security cameras, the door locking mechanisms, the radios, et cetera. All of those are important elements and are all part of a comprehensive safety plan. We would not share publicly every single element of that, as that is not a recognized best practice for a school district, but suffice to say, it is something that is of high priority in Livonia Public Schools. This board has made it a priority, and I can certainly assure you that our district administration and school administration have done the same. One other important element that I want to mention, and of course this isn't an exhaustive list, but I don't think we can underestimate the additional commitment we've made in the form of mental health supports. As you know, we shared in our last budget a then and now presentation from 2016-17 to now. When we talk about school psychologists almost doubling in number, our school social workers the same, the ability to put a social worker, a psychologist, and a student assistance provider at every high school, increasing our elementary support teachers and ESAPs from 1 to 2 at our elementary schools. Each of these components, these mental health providers, these social emotional supports for our students, and essentially also to support our staff and our work with our students, is a commitment that is truly unparalleled and something that I think is, again, something that we will see the results of that for years to come. That will not just be an immediate one-time element. That's something that we will see the result of that investment for many, many years. And so I just certainly want to assure our community that this is high on our radar screen. We are continuously, again, refining and reviewing our processes. We'll continue to do that with our staff, with our administrators, with our community. And if parents have questions at any time about what those are, to the ability that we're able to go into detail about those, we would certainly be happy to do that. So I appreciate you just giving me a few minutes, because this is something, when it truly is this close to home, I think there's a different element that our community has felt with the tragedy in Oxford. And so while we certainly feel it when there's a school tragedy anywhere in our nation, I think it was felt exponentially because there were many, many personal connections to Oxford. And so I think it's important that our community knows that this continues to be at the forefront for us. They are welcome to ask us questions at any time about practices, procedures, protocols, and that goes for our staff as well. So we'll continue. We're meeting with our administrative leaders tomorrow in a couple of different sessions for them to be able to continue to bring communication and information back to our staff. And so we know that we are certainly very, very pleased with the pieces we have in place, but we're never complacent about those pieces and continuously look to refine them. So we want to, again, make sure that our students have the support that they need, that they feel comfortable communicating with us when there's a concern, or even through the hotline of OK to Say. We have our social emotional hotline for students who may not have reports of concern, but rather have just some of their own. So there are many different mechanisms that we invite our students to use, our parents to use, and our staff as well, as we look to just, again, wrap our arms around the community, do all that we can to have our children feel that our schools are those safe havens for them. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, but appreciate just a little bit of time this evening to highlight that.
Thank you, Mrs. Oquist. Are there questions or comments from the board? And as you said, Mrs. Oquist, and I'd like to just reiterate, there are many aspects of our security plan that we can share with folks if they have questions. There are some aspects of that, however, that we cannot share, and that is part of the security plan, and that would be consistent with any organization's security plan, is that some of those things are confidential, and that's part of the security of it. Yes. So, okay, thank you. And thank you very much.
I'm sorry, if that topic was on, I apologize.
No, I just wanted to thank you, Mrs. Oquist, for covering that and covering it quite thoroughly. I know a number of us have received emails asking various parts of the security, and I think it's very helpful this evening for you to be able to give that kind of an overview to our entire community. And I'm glad that you're welcoming questions if folks do have them.
Of course.
So, thank you.
My
Questions or?
apologies.
Nope.
We actually have the cable portion portion of our broadcast is currently down,
Okay,
and we can fix it with a reboot, but we'd have to come off for like a minute
that's fine.
and then come back on. Would you like to do that?
Absolutely. For those who may not have been able to hear Mr. Francis, it looks like our cable portion of our broadcasting has gone down. We are going to be at recess for just a couple of minutes while we reboot, and then we will be right back with you. So we are right now at recess. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back to the continuation of the Livonia Public Schools Board of Education Committee of the Whole meeting of December 6, 2021. Thank you for being patient with us during our brief recess. We were dealing with a few technical issues. We are now on to item 3, building and site, and I'm going to turn the meeting over to Mr. Centers.
Thank you. We have 2 items this evening. The first item is 3A. It's Project 1 Bond Update Presentation. Mr. Francis will be leading that discussion for us.
Do we need an additional chair?
Yes,
here?
I'm going to grab one in a moment because I'm going to turn these microphones over. But I just wanted to introduce Mr. Paul Tyrrell and Mr. Brian Weber from Plant Moran Cressa. This evening, we also have Mr. Dale Jerome from French Associates who will be joining us shortly. We want to start off, we have a PowerPoint presentation that we're going to run through with the board. Really, Plant Moran Cressa and French are going to take the majority of the presentation because it is regarding an update on where we're at with the bond currently. In the first year of the bond, as those of you who worked through the 2013 bond are aware, it's really a tight timeline. In future years, we'll have literally a full year to do it, but with the bond passing in May, those time schedules get constricted and restricted a little bit. So we don't always have, we're not going to have this season, I should say, as much at this time next year in December as we do now. So we're going to give an update to the board and the community where we're at with the Project 1, which is the renovations within the buildings. We have Project 2, which is a separate architectural firm, which is the Early Childhood Center and the LCTC/robotics build. But tonight, we're going to focus on Project 1, and also Plant Moran Cressa will actually, in the early slides, focus on some generalities of the bond, selling of bonds, some timelines, some things that the team has done thus far. So that's just sort of a brief setup. I'm going to turn it over to Paul and to Brian to lead off. This is your...
Do I need to point in a certain direction? or
No, it just works like magic.
All righty. Well, thank you for the intro. Are you handing out
I am.
hard slides or no? We can help here.
I got it. No, you guys,
Alrighty.
go ahead.
Thank you.
All right, well, good evening. Thank you, Phil, for the intro, and thanks for having us once again. As Phil stated, trying to give an overall, kind of a reminder summary of overall what the bond program is, roll into progress we've made to date for the last few months since the last time you saw us for an update, and then roll into a presentation with French to get in some of the specifics of actual design progress in some of the buildings for renovation so far in the last few months. So moving on to slide 2. This is kind of a snapshot of what was told to the community, what the goal was, why we're doing the bond now, the whole bond program. The why now, essentially we're rolling off the 2013 bond. We had the capital plan, the 10-year capital plan that we identified the immediate needs for the last program. This one was picking up where we left off, where we did not have enough funds for the last one and capitalizing on the advantage of not having a new tax increase for the community, but still addressing the needs that were immediate for the district. Benefits of the bond, once again, still improving educational opportunities. Programs evolve, technology evolves, everything evolves over years. So we're using this to continue to adapt and improve the community in the district as well as we work through this. That includes modernizing learning environments, school safety enhancements, and then overall infrastructure upgrades that are inherent with all the renovations that we're taking on. Once again, a summary, the cost was $186 million that was approved. It was a 20-year millage, and once again, a zero tax increase to the community. A little bit of a breakout of that same scope of work for the $186 million of how we got to that. Facility improvements for the $122.9 million. That does focus on the renovations within the existing facilities of existing schools within the district. And I'll get into the details of what those renovations are in further slides. New educational facilities, that highlights Project 2 with the new robotics addition and the Early Childhood Center. Information technology. Some of this is standalone equipment, others are infrastructure upgrades or technology improvements that coincide with the construction renovations that are ongoing. Site improvements mainly focuses on the new playgrounds that have been installed throughout the district. Once again, some of that was touched in the last bond program. This is addressing those that were not touched at that time. Furniture and instructional equipment, exactly what it sounds like. There will be furniture purchased in the areas we're renovating, and then also money set aside for instructional equipment that needs to be either upgraded or replaced since the last bond program. Another simple one, new buses and maintenance equipment. So obviously fleets get older. We have structured that to replace the fleet throughout the whole bond program, just not one big purchase, but as the bond progresses, there'll be purchases along the way. And the last one is the financing and other costs associated with the bond sale and legal fees and finance fees.
If there's ever a point that anybody wants to address on that slide, feel free. We don't
Yes,
have to go
absolutely.
through the entirety of it. Feel free to jump in on that particular topic.
So drilling in a little bit of the detail for the facility improvements. Obviously, library media center renovations, that's been a big talking point in the last few meetings as well. So that's a little bit of, or a lot of it, what French will be detailing once he gets to his presentation. Kitchens and serving line renovations, also part of the main renovations that are ongoing right now, the design of restroom renovations, addition of classroom air conditioning. So you'll see during the presentation, we have schools, we have 5 schools, which I'll get into, our renovations, including the air conditioning. There's also 7 schools that we're only doing the air conditioning. We'll revisit those schools at a later date in a future year to do the full renovations within those sites. And the intent is to try and expedite and get air conditioning throughout the district. New educational facilities.
I'm just going to jump in on the air conditioning portion, just to clarify for those who might be watching at home. I know we've discussed this with the board in the past, but the goal would be to, over the first 2 phases of the bond or 2 years of the bond, to have the air conditioning done. You know, from a construction standpoint, the most preferable way for construction companies to do it would be to, when you go into a building, you go in once, do the renovations and the air conditioning. But we did request and push to say we want to get that air conditioning in the educational areas of our buildings sooner rather than later, so we didn't have to wait 4, 5, 6 years for some buildings to get that. So we are going to run through that over the first 2 phases of the bond. We are still working on with our construction manager, Clark Construction, on a schedule. So we are working towards, whether it be over the summer or into the fall and into the school year, being the phase 1 of air conditioning only. But we are intending to do that over 2 years. So we just want to make sure that anybody watching at home who might be a staff member or have students in the buildings, all of the buildings will not be done at one time, but we are expediting it over 2 phases.
Thank you, Phil. Moving into the new educational facilities, this touches base again on the Project 2, the robotics and the early childhood center. Moving into further items of scope of work, information technology. Big thing is getting back into the classroom technology and upgrading systems within that. This is another one that has been established where some of the items that were updated later in last bond, we're not rushing to replace those. There's still some life left in those systems. So we're strategizing to make sure that we wait off as long as possible and those get replaced at the end of their life and not prior to. Library Media Center, so this once again coincides with the renovations. We have IDS on board that is our technology designer that is working hand in hand with French and TMP to make sure the technology systems are enhanced with their design, and those packages go out together and are coordinated accordingly. Mobile learning devices and equipment, what this is kind of mimics everything else is some of these get to the end of their useful life in phases, so we will structure it to replace those and refresh those pieces of equipment accordingly as they're ending their useful life. Getting into less fancy stuff here, but infrastructure improvements, surveillance system upgrades. We know that there's, same thing, technology gets old with those, we have to replace them, or if we find any issues with them, we can take the time to address that now. Printers and copiers, and the wireless network upgrades. Once again, repeating what I'm saying, but it's a matter of we've staged this with the IDS to understand from the last program, what's going to hit now, what do we focus on early, and what do we wait and push off towards later in the bond. Next one is furniture. So in the 2013 bond, the big focus was on replacing student furniture. What was neglected was the staff furniture in a lot of these classrooms. So we're taking the time now to look at and address staff furniture in the classrooms to make sure we bring those up. There are a couple pictures in here that you'll see are quite antiquated furniture they're still working with. So the goal is to replace that and bring that up to the 21st century. And then alongside that, the furniture within the media centers, we're trying to create flexible collaborative furniture within those spaces. It's a big part of go renovate a space. We need the furniture to function with it. So we're making sure that we actually brought the architects on board, previously approved, to design that with each space. Wrapping up the scope of work portion of it, Site improvements. The district has started replacing playground systems at the schools, elementary schools. There's a sample here, but they are still working through and completing sites for that.
I'm just gonna make a quick note on that. It's one of those items that, as I mentioned a little bit ago, the bond was passed in May. We really wanted to be able to begin expenditures using those dollars for something for staff, for students, for our buildings, and something that you can do relatively quickly. It was the playground equipment. It wasn't quite as quickly as we thought it was going to be based upon supply chain issues, but we did jump on that actually late May and brought that to the board, and we're able to get on order, and many of them have been installed at this point in our elementaries. There was a pretty long delay for some of our buildings, but they started to pop recently in getting installed. So I just wanted to give a quick update on that. So that was a little bit of angst over the fall, but still a fun and exciting thing to be able to do is now know that the vast majority of our playground equipment at our elementary schools, K through 6, are at most only a few years old. There is still some equipment in those playgrounds, not to be, not to hide any information, that are certainly older, but those were items that are deemed safe, and from the principal, kids like them, want to continue using them. So those types of items we kept. And those are generally smaller type items. The large structures, swings, et cetera, we replaced.
And wrapping up the scope of work, the buses and maintenance equipment we had touched on, and then the financing, issuance costs and closing costs.
If I could just jump in for a moment. So obviously that was a lot of information, kind of what the bond was about and what some of the informational materials that were kind of shared with the community and internally as well. It's good to kind of take a step back. I think once in a while, we're in it every day, Brian and Phil especially, and Allison, but just to remember what it was that, the goals of this bond were. It is an incredibly challenging environment at the moment, as everyone's aware. Not just all the school safety issues and pandemic issues that we've been faced with, but the global supply chain issues have really taken this to another level as far as design and construction goes. Not just the fact that we can't get materials and that prices have escalated, but there is so much work in southeastern Michigan. Dale and I were just joking about, hey, I've got some other projects to bid. Do you guys even have the capacity to design them? Do we have anyone that has the capacity to build them? So it's literally kind of a once in a generation, I hope, type of event. So as we're looking at our goals, we're constantly trying to prioritize, as Brian said and as Phil said, how can we stretch the dollars further? How can we do as much of the scope as possible? So there may be some times along the way where we're looking at 3 or 4 different options, getting estimate numbers that are extremely high and trying to find ways to do things differently, how to bring those costs down within range of where we need to be. So you're going to see a lot of that going on with this first batch of projects. Hopefully, fingers crossed, by next year it calms down a little bit. I'm going to keep saying that and hope it happens. But this first year is going to be very, very challenging. If you remember last time in the 2013 bond, we were well under budget the first year. That is not going to be the case this time. We're going to be fighting and scratching and clawing for every dollar that we can this first year. So that's my doom speech that I've been giving to everybody lately. It is crazy out there, and we're doing the best we can to stay on track. So,
All right, thank you.
And also, just along that line, thank you to our parents and our community members who have been patient with us. The education world, as you said, is no different with the supply chain situation. And I know playgrounds were especially stressful for some of our parents and our littlest learners to be patient. We had to take a lot of that equipment out on the timeline we were given. And then, of course, like everything else in the supply chain world, all of our new equipment did not arrive as promptly as it had been promised. But thank you very much to all of our community members who have been patient, who have taken the opportunity to use that as a teachable moment with our little kids and have some other fun things to do on the playground while we waited for our newer, bigger equipment to arrive. But just thanks to our community for being patient through the whole thing. I'm sure, like anything else in the world, and Christmas is going to be no different, that not everything will arrive exactly on time, but thank you for their patience.
All right, if there's no questions, I'm going to roll into, of the highlighted items or the summary we had, just progress to date, what we've been working on the last few months here.
So we're going back to the presentation now.
Okay, going back in time, back to June, actually, just summarize, we did sell Series 1 of the June, of the bond. So of the $186 million, the first series was sold at $78 million. So that's money we have received in the account right now that we're working with, designing to it, and eventually using those dollars for the forthcoming summer's construction. Obviously, touching base again, we did receive favorable interest rates at the time of the sale, which is another plus. The next activity we rolled out right after selecting our team was working on a district book of standards. So that what we have is essentially to make sure standardizing materials, equipment, devices, controls throughout the district. So Mr. Francis' team, Mr. Lau's team can go into a building and their staff knows how to, knows what they're getting into if something breaks. It's not 1,000 different pieces and parts in the warehouse. It's standardized stuff that they can work with and can fix in a timely manner, so there's not a lot of variables in the district. So it just helps in efficiencies.
Yeah, some of those, just to give a little bit of a little broader idea here, is that, we're not down to only one paint color, one carpet, we don't go quite that tight, except for certain areas where we talk about perhaps the controls for our heating and cooling systems, et cetera. That is a unified item, across the district. But we do narrow it down, making sure that we have perhaps a standard sink for student restrooms at different grade levels, et cetera. But we might have the same manufacturer for carpeting, and within this line, any of those were available to buildings, et cetera. So we try to do that as best as possible to keep it narrowed down, so we don't have to keep, 40 different paint lines in the warehouse for all the different buildings. It makes it very, very difficult from a maintenance standpoint. But at the same time, we do have some choices available to the buildings, and it's those fun days going in with the designers and the architects, with the building folks, and saying, here are some choices of how to finish off, these spaces. So it's a balance, and we have choice, but not unlimited choice, so that we can balance that with maintenance.
And one other thing to touch base, it's noted here, but we're also adapting to technology upgrades and code updates. The 2013 bond actually had fluorescent lights as the standard light system. It was at a time where still the economy wasn't accepting it, that the pricing wasn't right at the 13 time, but midway through the bond, it did flip where LED lighting was then the way to go. So stuff like that we pick up and make sure we're updating to make sure that standard fixtures are now being used moving forward. So it's a lot of that balance as well, too. Assemblage of the bond team. French Associates, TMP Architecture, obviously on board designing with us. Those are both of our architects for Project 1 and 2. Clark Construction Company is on board for both projects, working along, doing constructability reviews, scheduling, estimates along the way. So they're attending all of our meetings as well. And then noting a few of the other vendors that are on board have been active as well. G2 Geotechnical, so for building additions, they sample the soils on the site to make sure that we can build upon it. It's an engineer that works with our designers and engineering team to make sure that there's suitable soils to put these buildings on. Sellinger Associates, our commissioning agent, once again, a third-party engineer that essentially will review our systems, make sure that they have any input, they can integrate that for another set of eyes, and then helps implement and make sure things function at the end of the day after construction is complete or during the construction, and make sure that the systems being handed over to the district are going to be functioning the way that they were designed to. Chemtech Associates have been on board for a long time with the district. They are surveyors that survey the properties for us on behalf, or for the building additions as well. And then Arch Environmental, another one the district is known for. We will get into abatement for asbestos. We didn't get everything in the last bond, so there will be items to address from an abatement standpoint as well as we do these projects. And I did leave off, I just noticed the IDS, they are technology designers, as I had mentioned before, are working with alongside TMP and French to make sure that the technology systems are being upgraded alongside of it. And they also do have standalone projects that we're working with Tim Clan's staff to design concurrently. Next item up, and one we'll discuss later in this meeting, on the heels of what Paul had noted, the market right now is a little bit crazy. So in a typical world, we can bundle everything into trade contractor packages to buy all the equipment they'll be installing. Given the market right now, there's a lot of long lead times that we cannot wait that long for. So we've identified with the team of some select HVAC equipment and potentially kitchen equipment that if we wait until the February timeline to get those ordered, we don't think we'd hit our end date. So the team's worked quite a bit to understand what's really necessary. It makes things difficult to do that, but felt it was in the best interest of the district and the programs to isolate some of those systems and get them purchased early.
When we have these items, and we'll talk a little bit about this, like Brian said, about the HVAC pre-price, pre-purchase, we've worked side by side with the district's legal counsel with regard to making sure that everything that we do in the processes that we followed for that pre-purchase are not violating any requirements of the board, tax, et cetera. All of those items, Clark Hill was very on top of, and made sure that when we met repeatedly before we went forward, that the district is doing everything according to the law, and we are in good condition with regard to how we're going to handle the pre-purchase, and then turn those items over to whichever vendor or contractor ends up doing the HVAC installation. So I just want to make sure that the board is aware that we certainly brought counsel in for these discussions and contracts.
Thanks, Phil. I don't know if I'm still on, I may be behind a slide there. Oh, no, program verification. So going inside a lot of these meetings, there's a lot of communication internally with Mr. Francis' team, Mr. Lau's team, the architects, engineers, but we've also established committees with staff and administration in the district. That we're not working in a silo, just our small group. Media centers, library media centers, there's a lot changing in that world, so we've made sure to bring on the appropriate people, get them in the room, discuss what the program needs are, how we facilitate that, and how to make that space best for what we think is not just now, but moving into the future, and having those conversations of how we set that up for a good foundation right now. So that's not just architects and Cressa and Mr. Francis' team. It's a lot of communication with a lot of members of the district.
Yeah, we have obviously the specific building folks that we're working on in the summer of '22, but from the media center perspective, the district LMC task force was involved. They put together reports at the elementary and secondary levels and submitted those with how they envisioned their vision for a future of Livonia Public Schools library media centers. How they would be utilized, what they would look like, how they can function. So using that along with getting some input from them, we held a couple of meetings with French associates and invited the media specialists to join a virtual meeting on a couple of different dates. And then at the building level specifically, at these 5 buildings we're doing summer of '22, those media specialists were in the page turners and working with and through their building principal for the both hopes and concerns that they had with the media centers.
Some of the things that we're doing that are new and different and exciting, and media centers is one of them. Some of this, even our folks, we don't know what we don't know yet. Have we been able to tour some other facilities that have already been done, or whether that's in person or virtually, to see what some of the possibilities are? Because I imagine that we aren't even thinking about what some of the options are because we don't live in that world. But one of the benefits I know of bringing on some of the companies that we have brought on was so that we could get some of these ideas and look at what some neighboring folks have done that we may not have even thought about.
Yeah, we did take some visits, both to media centers and robotic centers. So we were able to go out to several different schools and school districts and view and get a tour of media centers and robotic centers that were either brand new builds or completely renovated. So we did move in that direction, yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Touching base on a couple other items here, like Phil mentioned, not just media center related, but we are doing kitchens and serving lines as well. That's something that we discuss school by school. That's not a one-size-fits-all. So we went and met with that staff as well to understand bottlenecks and how they function and student counts. And obviously, this is a different year with funding for meals, so they're getting an in-surge. But it's something we want to understand how these spaces are flowing. There's a little bit of a variety in the district of how these kitchens are laid out. Some the size of one of these tables, others are quite massive. So
that may have been an exaggeration.
Yes. So it's been a school-by-school meetings. Like I said, we're trying to adapt and account for a lot of different footprints. And then last on the board and public accountability, I'm just showing that we are coming to meetings like this and want to make sure that we are communicating properly with the community and they understand what's going on, not with just these updates with designs to keep them up to speed. Also with the recommendation, any award recommendation, we're communicating and letting everybody know as we progress here and getting vendors on board, just to show progress. And then we will be forthcoming in '22 with quarterly dashboard updates that we did in the 13 bond program. They'll give a financial summary, updates, not as quite as extensive as this, but as we move along, we'll start picking up steam of progress site by site, and we'll keep everybody communicated on how we're doing on the projects. So without further ado, I believe this would be breaking news to some people, but the 2022 projects that we will be presenting on later today tonight with French, we broke it out by Project 1 and Project 2, and then once again, which sites are getting the full renovations, what are getting just air conditioning upgrades this season with renovations that follow in later years. So for Project 1, full renovations, the elementary schools will be Coolidge, Kennedy, and Randolph. And then also we'll have Cooper Upper Elementary and Emerson Middle School will be getting full renovations. And then the classroom air conditioning only elementary schools are Grant, Hayes, and Hoover, Johnson, Holmes, and Riley for the upper and middle schools. And then Churchill High School, a portion of that already has air conditioning, so we talked a lot internally about how to balance and make sure we get a good count for this one to try and tackle it in the 2 years. And Churchill was one of those where it fit in the size because a good portion of it is already air conditioned. So we're going to try and grasp the balance of those rooms that are not conditioned and pick those up in this season as well.
Something real quick, sometimes from a facility standpoint, we look at buildings, elementary versus what are both upper elementary and middle school. We lump those two together as opposed to the upper elementaries with the lower elementaries because of the facility. The upper elementaries are former junior high / middle school buildings, so they match from a facility standpoint our current 3 middle schools. So I apologize for any confusion, but a lot of times we lump in Johnson, Riley, and Cooper with Holmes, Frost, and Emerson because of the facility size. Just a clarification there.
Next up was Project 2. So this is the robotic or LCTC renovations, which also ties into the robotics edition that's going on the same property. So that is TMP that's designing that. We'll be back in February. Given the complexity of that project, the design is staggered from what you'll see today and I'll get to the steps, but it's design development is about 2 months behind on that one, but it's by design and there's a lot more into the building addition there. So that one will be brought to the board for a presentation in February. And then rolling into information technology, this crosses over between Project 1 and Project 2. Surveillance systems are being looked at right now. The existing equipment is in need of replacement, so Mr. Klan and IDS are currently looking at existing facilities and understanding where upgrades are. Going to look at some potential new systems and either do test runs or go visit those facilities, or visit other districts that they're being utilized in right now to see if we need to do any testing of those before we make a decision on what system they would want to upgrade to. Wireless networks. Currently the system is a newer technology, but there are potentials for gaps of the coverage. It's a new age where you need Wi-Fi in areas you may not need it 8-10 years ago. So there's right now looking to fill minor gaps in some of the buildings, but on a wholesale upgrade is not going on just yet. That'll be further down the line in the bond program. And then we've said before, library media centers, that the IT is being designed with it. And then last two, abatement goes hand in hand with the renovation projects throughout the district. All buildings are of the age where we have to assume that there's still abatement there. And then inherently move management. It's just a matter of, we have to take over space, whether we do some of that internally or need to hire out a third-party vendor to help move pieces and parts out, like construction, to expedite the start of construction, and then move back in at the end of the season. Any questions for progress so far?
One other quick question. You mentioned wireless networks and filling some minor gaps. Do we have right now wireless capability in our athletic press boxes? And if we don't, are we getting it?
That is a great question. I don't know the answer to.
I believe we do, but I know we're looking at density upgrades really everywhere, as Brian mentioned. What people might have been found acceptable, 7 or 8 years ago when the district, actually prior to that, the district didn't have Wi-Fi at all, I don't believe. So if you look at some of the common areas, the gymnasiums, the cafeterias, the press boxes, the stadiums, those types of areas, we're definitely looking to beef the system up so that, hundreds of people can be online at the same time versus maybe dozens, 10 years ago, so, or 8 years ago, so.
I'll confirm on the press boxes at the, you're talking about
Okay.
the 3 high schools
Yes.
fields. So I'll confirm on that, whether it does have the Wi-Fi or not. We
I know we brought low voltage out there.
yeah.
I think there
And
is.
we
but-
had, when we put the scoreboards in, there were some questions over some things, so I just want to, I want to confirm up.
Okay.
And I'll just get you an email or.
That'd be great. Thank
get
you.
An update. Mhm.
Alrighty.
I'm going to invite Dale Jerome, French Associates, up to the microphone. And I think he's going to be taking us through the 5 buildings for summer of '22, that renovation project. He's going to show you some floor plans overall and a little bit of like current and then future for the media centers.
I'll take this last one and then hand over to you, Dale. So this just is checklist, it's a little bit small font here, but kind of describing the process once we bring an architect on board, get our team together. Initially, we talk programming, scope verification, what are we using the spaces for, so they don't just start drawing something that is not relevant. So we get a lot of input from the district, from the users to see what the needs are of each space. From there, our first step is called schematic design. It's our first pass of design, then gets turned over to the owner. Obviously, we're part of the meetings with it, but a set of drawings is issued for schematic layouts. We talk through, Clark Construction gets their hands on it, can put an initial estimate together just to make sure we're in the ballpark and things are headed in the right direction. From there, we get to the stage we are now with Project 1 is design development. Further enhancing those details, making revisions from the schematic, a lot of input from the team, doing site visits, site walks, a lot of those have taken place with the team. Sometimes with building staff, others just engineers getting into the nooks and crannies of the building to find further information as needed. So that's what I'll turn it over to Dale. We're doing an overview of the design development, so that's our last green check mark there as we roll through the balance of the process.
Great, thanks, Brian. And good evening, everyone. It's good to be back at the table with you.
Good evening.
So I'm just going to walk you through the plans of the buildings here. I think many of you were part of the previous bond proposal, so these diagrams and the format is similar to what you may remember from the last time. And it's really just a way to communicate to you by using color and graphics what the scope of the work is in each of the buildings as we walk through this. So the first building that you're looking at here is Coolidge Elementary School. There's several shaded areas of blue tones that I'll get into a little more detail in on the next slide. And then there's the green areas, which represent the kitchen and serving areas that are being renovated at these buildings. There are in a couple of schools a red or light shade of red area where we're making some slight modifications to the office areas. And then the purple dots that you see dispersed around the floor plan represent doors. If you remember in the previous bond, we touched pretty much all of the doors along the corridors into the classrooms or into the building proper. This time around, we're going within the classrooms and within the areas off of the corridor and replacing the remaining doors that didn't get replaced last time. So that's what those represent. And then the gold zones that are highlighted are the bathrooms, in a lot of cases within or adjacent to the classroom or used by the students. And this represents areas of primarily tile that will be tiled over, old or worn out tile within those bathrooms areas. And I should point out that that is something that will be bid as an alternate, and we can talk a little bit more about that in detail.
I'm going to just mention something quickly, just as a point of note that you may recall when we were in the bond campaign and we were talking about the dollars, we talked about doors, right? And we talked about that with the size and breadth of, our schools, et cetera, just the scope of work as it relates to doors was significant. If you take a look just at that first drawing and look at every one of the purple dots, it is probably almost hard to believe that all of those are original, generally original to the building doors, which meaning, they're 50 to 60 years old. And as you recall, we didn't replace those doors interior to the classrooms, and it really ended up being, certainly it was a financially prudent decision, but it ended up being aesthetically one that we were a bit disappointed with as we came through from the renovations. And so we knew that was something we wanted to come back around to this time. But I think oftentimes when we looked at the approximate dollar amount, we questioned how it could be that significant. And really, as you look at just one school here, you see what we'll be able to do as far as bringing all of those upgrades up to the same level as the corridor or exterior doors. So I just thought I'd make a note of that, because when you look at this and you see how many there are, it is surprising, because we're talking about an elementary school here, and there are a significant number just in this drawing.
Another item of note along, since we're jumping into these, is that you notice that there's not work really being done inside the classrooms other than those doors. It's because, just to remind the community, we renovated, that was really the heart of the 2013 bond, was to renovate classrooms floor to ceiling, and that has been accomplished. We did walk early on with the architects from French to these buildings, walked through classrooms, took a look at them, and said, what kind of condition are they in? And we actually found them to be, generally speaking, in excellent condition. Our maintenance and custodial staff do a wonderful job maintaining those spaces. In some areas, we may find that there's baseboard that we might need, either wasn't put in originally in the 2013 bond in some areas, or maybe it needed to be replaced now, or the teaching wall might need painting, which isn't an uncommon thing, but overall, they're in excellent condition. And so when you see the work not being done in those classrooms, it's because we did just do those classrooms.
Okay.
Sorry, Dale.
Oh, no worries. If we go to the next slide, you'll see this is zooming in on the media center itself. And in each of these diagrams, you'll see a top half where it shows you the existing layout, and then below that is the color graphics to illustrate. And while each of the schools have a unique footprint in their existing media center, the goal at the end of the projects is to have some uniformity in terms of opportunities or the types of spaces that each media center has. So there's several different shades of blue. The lightest blue represents basically classroom areas where there could be devices used in a computer setting. There's a flexible space for the instructor in that space to gather students into that space for, again, instructional purposes. The medium blue is kind of what you would think of as the media center proper. That's where the books are housed in shelving. And then there are further furniture arrangements for, again, classroom gathering of groups of students and/or small pockets of students to break out into different areas. And then the dark blue shade is an area that's labeled, you can see the label there, Idea Factory. And I think that's a way of describing kind of a unique space. I'm sure you've probably heard the term Makerspace. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably the closest thing that I would say the Idea Factory will be, is a Makerspace type of area for the students. And then, of course, there are the remaining purple dots in the yellow representing, again, some of the doors and bathrooms in that area. These furniture layouts are fairly well thought out, but still a work in progress. So we'll actually be bringing a more detailed 3D visualization of the spaces with the furniture in those in January, I think is the target, right?
Yeah, I think we're aiming for that meeting in January, where we can come back with a little bit more detail.
Just to jump back, there was one thing I forgot to mention on the previous slide. You look just outside the media center, there's a couple like triangular items on the floor plan there, just to the right of the media center. We're adding an outdoor classroom space at each building, and one of the alternates that we're hoping to add to that area is a shade structure, essentially a system of columns with like triangular sail-shaped fabric covering to provide shade in those areas. So that's what those represent. I forgot to highlight that when I was on the previous plan.
I've got One quick question, I'm not sure which one of you wants to address this. Computer lab, is that something we utilize as we have traditionally? Because it seems like we've been putting so many devices into the classrooms, is that planned to be used as we've traditionally used it, or does it have a different purpose?
You want it?
Sure. And so we've had a lot of discussion about that, and for the most part, we have begun to utilize one of the two computer labs for classroom space or other space at our schools because of the influx of mobile devices. And so most schools still have, I'm talking at the elementary level, have one stationary lab. What we've talked about is setting up this space where we still have some flexibility over the next several months to make a determination if they will be utilized based on the furniture and the configuration with a place for mobile devices or a place for hardwired desktop computers. And so we're still finalizing that piece, but in general, we believe the movement will be toward flexible areas where you can utilize mobile devices. So you could still be in there together, each having a computer, having an instructional space, but not limiting it in the way it is when we have hardwired desktop computers. And so really, as we increase our use of mobile devices and our flexibility with that, we really see that as our path moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, that was really part of most of the input that we're hearing is that a mobile device computer lab can be used for anything at other times. A hardwired computer lab traditionally is one thing and one thing only. It's always that, so it only gets used a partial amount of the time. So we want to make sure in the IT department that we find the right tool for the job. So we need to be able to print, we need to be able to do some other things that potentially a Chromebook wouldn't be able to accomplish. But from our perspective, we're going to make the space so that the most use can be had out of it, and we'll find the right tool for that.
Okay, thank you.
So I see in the design that, there's some bookshelves, and we talked about putting books back in. How are we deciding which books to put back in? I know a lot of libraries have gone to book storage, and that it's not necessarily where the kids go and peruse the bookshelves anymore. And how are we deciding which books to put back out and what square footage we want to utilize for bookshelves versus learning areas?
No, that's a good question. And first of all, we have in the district, two media and technology coordinators now who are absolute godsends at this time because they've been involved quite a bit with these renovations. They've been in actually these page-turner meetings. We've worked in tandem with the academic services department, which they're a part of, as well as IT. So I'm just going to, big shout out to Paul and Judy who have been wonderful and jumped right into this process for this school year. And they've been a big help with this conversation along with, the media specialist input. Now, which books isn't what we're looking at, right? We're looking more at space utilization, and for that part, what we leaned on was the American Library Association has a ratio, a recommended or suggested ratio of books to students, and we actually took that ratio and working with the media and technology coordinators and talking through it in some groups, said, let's raise them up because actually, especially at the elementary level, there's a high demand for books. And those fluctuate from building to building and classroom to classroom, but there's a high requirement, a high need for books to put in students' hands. So we made that ratio higher. Then as you progress up through the levels, that ratio starts to come back down more towards what the ALA has recommended. Once we get into, say, a high school, we're looking at items that are more like reference style items to save that space and to put those online or in a database and have more of the books that students would want to check out for reading, for class, for pleasure, for those types of things. Because frankly, what our secondary staff tells us is this is where they get their books. They're really not and this is a very general statement, so I apologize to anybody who does utilize the public libraries and whatnot, most of our students get their books from our libraries. So we want to make sure we do have them stocked appropriately, but we also want to be able to use our spaces to the maximization that we can. So we have, we don't have furniture specifically picked out yet, but we do know that everything that's in those libraries are going to be on solid casters that we can move them if we have to, so there can be some flexibility, and we're working with a book ratio to be able to put into the different levels as we go through the buildings.
And then the media specialist will work in tandem with our media and tech coordinators to weed the collections. So we know how many books they currently have, and then we know what the ideal is based on each of these bookshelves. Some of them are 2 shelves, some are 3 shelves. We know the capacity that those shelves can take. So we know a total number of volumes that can be had in each of these libraries. Of course, it varies based on the space. And so that will be a process that our media specialists and our media coordinators will go through in weeding the collections to be able to accommodate this. And also to be able to look for some new collections that we can bring in as well. So it's a great question. It's actually a pretty complex question that we've had to work through, because in order to have some of those flexible spaces for students for work and collaboration in the media centers, we did have to make some changes with the number of volumes within each media center. So we certainly appreciate the guidance of our leadership in academic services to make those decisions, and also the input of our media specialists throughout the process.
And something that was universal was the ability to have sight lines across the room, no matter how big or how small it is. So that means the 8-foot shelves can't be in the middle of the room type of situation. So that sort of changes the game at different levels and how they're currently configured and what they currently use. So that, if you can't have an 8-foot bookshelf, you're not going to have as many books fitting in that bookshelf. So it is going to definitely be a weeding process, as Mrs. Oquist mentioned, and we do have classroom libraries in our elementary schools, so we do have books to get in students' hands in that manner as well. So we certainly want to have books in students' hands. We are an educational institution, and reading is incredibly important for learning and for pleasure, because they are combined. They are one and the same. So we are going to continue to work with the media and tech coordinators, and via them, the media specialists.
Thank you.
Sorry, we're taking more of your time.
Yeah, no, that's great.
This is important.
Yeah,
These are
good
good
discussion.
questions, and important discussion.
And I'm glad I don't have to decide which books, I just need to know how many. So, so the next building is Kennedy, and again, you see, although the floor plan may be different for each building, the scope of work tends to have trends or similarities. So again, you see the reimagining of the media center. In this case, some office areas adjacent to the media center that are shifted around. Again, the kitchen area, the green. In this case, the remote green rectangle down at the bottom of the floor plan represents that in this building we have to house some refrigeration outside of the footprint of the school. So that's why that's remote on the bottom there. And then again, the bathroom renovations and the door replacements you see throughout the building.
Those outdoor items are industrial restaurant grade. You find them often in different situations in different restaurants. So that's a pretty standard product, and it's meant to be outside. So if someone hears of a refrigerator outside, it is absolutely meant for that situation and designed as such.
Here again is the enlargement of the media center area. I would point out that at this building and some of the others, the classroom on the left-hand side, which would be, again, that flex space that could be used as a computer lab or other purposes, if that's the direction you decide to go, does have what we refer to as a nano wall. That's a brand name for basically a glass partition that can open that up to either be separate from the media center for instructional purposes or open to it for flexibility. So that left-hand side can either be open or closed off from the media center proper. You see the medium shade of blue again in the middle where primarily the collection is housed. And then down in the lower right-hand corner is the idea factory. And because we're shifting some things around in that footprint, we're recapturing some office space down in the lower right-hand corner that was previously in the area where the Idea Factory was.
And those offices are for the intervention.
The next floor plan is Randolph. Again, has its unique qualities. The one thing I would point out at Randolph is you do not see the plethora of purple dots in this building. That's because it does have much better stock of existing doors within the classroom areas. So we're not replacing those doors, but you see again the common shading of the green kitchen area, the blue in the media center, and then the gold for the floor tile replacement in the bathroom areas.
And Randolph is an example of a location on the outdoor classroom that may not be immediately off of the media center, because it's frankly impossible at Randolph because it's in the middle of the building, but we are looking to place those, even if it's not directly outside the media center, for the school, because they are going to be for school use, not just the media specialist.
So then in the media center enlargement, you see kind of the upper left is, again, primarily where the stack spaces are for housing the collection. The lower right combines the instructional space within the footprint of the media center proper, and then that bottom half is taking part of what is now a computer lab and making that into a flex space with that nano wall, that glass wall that I described earlier. And then the bottom half gets repurposed for some additional itinerant office spaces. One thing to note, I'm sure you may be familiar with this building, but it has a two-level, the Idea Factory, it will be in the top level of that kind of bi-level space that's within the footprint of this building. Yeah, oh, I'm sorry.
What is the determination for the size of the Idea Factories or the Makerspaces? I think those are one of the most exciting things that we're doing in the schools. It's getting our kids hands-on with a lot of very cool stuff. I think it's inspirational for the kids where they can really grow and enjoy and apply what they're learning. How are we determining the square footage and if that's adequate and how that's going to be adequate in the future as maybe the requirements of that kind of classroom or space it grows over time?
So generally speaking, the Idea Factory can house one classroom at a time. But the idea, again, with the glass wall, with the open, closed, transparency of the media center is that you can have students dispersed throughout the space. But I think generally speaking, the Idea Factory would be able to pull at least one class at a time into that space.
There wasn't a strict square footage on it. We left it with the idea, as Dale mentioned, to be able to get a class in there. And then since every media center is unique, you sort of find or create that space through old offices, et cetera. But generally, there has to be obviously an adult or a teacher with the class. So the idea being of potentially one teacher to one classroom amount of student ratio seemed to make sense.
So the next building is Cooper, Upper L. That moves us to a different grade level, a little bit larger building, but again, some of the same scope. The green area is the kitchen, proper and serving lines. Again, the gold areas represent toilet room renovations, and you see again the purple dots for it. I should also point that this grade level also is planned to provide the outdoor classroom, and generally speaking, we try to put that as close to the media center as makes sense to the outside of the building. So you see that in the left-hand side there. The media center here, again, pretty much some of the same spaces. You have, as you move into the larger grade levels, you have more students, and so you have a slightly larger collection. You also have a need to provide more instructional space, so those are provided as well. And then we still have the dark blue area, the Idea Factory, within the footprint of the upper L as well. This just zooms in. Oops, did I go too far?
Yeah, go back one.
There we go.
Go back another. There
Thank you. Got ahead of myself. Again, just zooming in on the media center. The lower left area of this plan is where primarily the stack space is. And I should point out in general, you probably see some of the unique shapes and different furniture arrangements. Again, next month we'll highlight some of those, but the idea is to provide different types of spaces for whether it be 1 to 2 students at a time, 4 to 5 at a time, or a full class of 30 students. We want to provide a variety of seating and furniture arrangements within the footprint of each of the media centers.
One of the other items that the buildings had shared was that they would like their media centers to also have the capability to house, if they had some type of meeting or PD, so adults, in the evening, if they wanted to have a meeting with parents, et cetera. So the furniture being flexible, the nano walls being able to open up wide and give you extra open space, all of that went into some of the planning, because that was definitely a clear item that came both from principals and media specialists, was we need to be able to use these spaces for things other than even just the students to have that capability. So French did their design with that in mind, and the furniture is a big piece of that. That's why we said even the book shelves would be mobile. Not that you'd want to roll them around every day. That would be that would be not making sense. But you can move all the items, including even the media specialists. I was suddenly blanked on the phrasing of it. The checkout.
Circulation.
The circulation desk, thank you, the circulation desk. I hope my wife's not watching. So, even the circulation desk, if you simply unplug from the data and the power from the floor, you could move that away if needed.
The next building in the bank of slides is Emerson Middle School. Again, you see very similar scope. The gold representing the restrooms, the green down in the lower left is the kitchen and serving area, and then the blue zone is the media center. Just point out, this one, I would say, of the media centers in this first project is maybe the most invasive in terms of remodeling. If you look at the upper existing floor plan and the bottom one, you see we're kind of clipping the lower right corner and really configuring the entrance into that space. And it just made a lot of sense to do that on this particular building. So you see, again, every building has its subtleties in terms of its existing qualities, but all of the same opportunities for students are provided in each media center and at each grade level. So that kind of covers the media center.
You entered just below the yellow area, so it was a pretty narrow hallway. I don't know if you've probably been in there for Leader and me and other presentations, but previously you would come down the hallway and then enter through just past the restrooms there, and enter kind of on the side of the LMC. And so now you'll enter on the opposite side. It'll be a bit more of a grand entrance, so there'll be a couple of pillars, and then it'll be on an angle there. You'll enter in, there'll be some flexible seating. Straight across will be an office for the media specialist with some glass-sided walls, and then you'll be able to move into the larger area. So that will really be a really nice presentation moment as students or parents or anyone enters that in a very different feel from where they were, how they had previously entered the media center.
So I know we've talked a lot about the media centers and we're very excited about them. I have a restroom question.
Okay.
How was, I know that there's some talk about, not here, just in generally about, redesigning the bathrooms to be maybe a little bit safer or a different flow pattern. Are we looking at just redoing the bathrooms as they are, or are we talking about doing maybe like the airport design where there are no doors on the bathroom, not on the stalls, saying that, just where like in the airport where, there's not really a door, right? There's kind of a squirrely thing so that you can't see in, but you can monitor the noise level and exit and enter a little bit easier. I know a lot of the kids have concerns about the restrooms and making those maybe a little better space for kids where they feel a little more welcome and safe.
Yeah. The scope of these is really focused on just working within the footprint of the space as is. There was a fair amount of work done in some of them as far as partitions and things like that previously. This is primarily focusing on the tile surfaces and retiling those areas. So some of the things that you described, I would tell you that they are not part of the scope.
And just to latch onto that, the main challenge would be the available square footage or
Right.
footprint of it. By doing that, in creating that new entry, you would lose capacity for the fixtures themselves, which by code and obviously convenience, we would need to maintain what we have, and reducing that would be a big impact to the school.
Yeah, they're unfortunately kind of embedded within the footprint of the school, and there's no space to go any larger within the footprint of the restroom. And that's typically what you need to accomplish some of the ideas that you described is just more space, sometimes even doubling, because you want one way in, one way out, like a lot of airports have. Well, that essentially doubles the footprint of the restroom, and unfortunately, we don't have that within the footprint of the existing building.
Have you spoken to the alternates yet?
Just, go ahead.
Oh, no, you can touch base.
Okay.
I can jump in as needed.
Yeah, so because of supply chain and budget concerns, we are building in alternates into the scope of work. And one of those alternates primarily are those tile surfaces that we just talked about. Our preference would be to do that now and accomplish that, to give that kind of final step in the refresh of the restrooms, if you will. But to build in somewhat of a cushion, we are bidding those items as alternates.
And just to clarify, obviously that would be, that scope, if we didn't like the pricing or didn't think it was favorable and overall budgets weren't there, we could de-scope, pull that scope exactly out, replace it with a paint or a lesser cost finish, to give us flexibility at the bid time without having to reissue documents and get another set of round of pricing from contractors. We would have it on bid day.
Yeah, there's a lot of Renovate items in there, so like the fixtures, the toilets, the partitions, all of that we replaced in the 13 bond. It was really just a refresh of, there's tile, as an example, you can walk into one of the restrooms, those fixtures are new, all those items that I mentioned are new, but the tile is original, so we wanted to give that a more modern feel. Some of them might be broken up a little bit. It's actually relatively good condition for considering how old our buildings are. But our goal is to refresh those restrooms, like finish the refresh of the restroom. And is it Emerson that ceilings were also, or is it Cooper? I'm blanking.
I believe it's Cooper.
Cooper. So I think Cooper, we had some ceilings that we need to address as well. So we do want to go in there. We just have to do alternates to be proactive and try to be a little bit conservative to have a way to move around if there were dollars that were coming in too high in spaces. But it's our true intention to get those renovated and done and up to date. Little touches here and there. One of the buildings we looked at, changing the mirrors potentially, et cetera, just to give it that kind of that new feel, that more modernized feel.
So we're talking about tile on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
wall tile
Mhm.
behind the
Yep.
faucets,
It-
et cetera.
Yep.
And so there's different gradients of cost related to that. And so they'll price that out. And so it may be as basic as paint, refresh, and floor tile only. It may be wall tile. So it will be based on the estimates that we receive. And so that'll be broken out in multiple facets. That's just one of the ways, just as a cost containment measure. We know what we'd like to do. That would be our A+ position, but we also know the minimum that we need to do, and so we'll find that spot in between once we get those firm estimates in.
And it's a push-pull with regard to with cost, because we also have some K4 restrooms that we were just having this conversation today about the urinals are actually built in level with the floor, and you can't just put tile on top of the current tile, but removing old tile can be incredibly challenging. So we're talking about what different ideas. I shouldn't use the word alternate because it sounds like the bid process, but what other ideas we can do to accomplish, and perhaps just those specific restrooms that make it more beautiful, but also we want longevity, we want maintenance that is achievable by our crews, et cetera. So we keep talking through those with our partners at Clark and our partners at French, and we just had that conversation today, once we found that existing condition and said, you can't just put a tile on top of the tile, because now you've got a lip over the urinal that it will not work. So we continue to work on those items.
And one other quick question. Just outside of the Emerson LMC on the newly renovated portion and the entrance that's at an angle, there's a small circle. What does that denote?
There will actually be a column there.
Okay,
Because we're essentially taking away the corner.
gotcha.
We still have to leave at least one little chunk of
A pole of some sort for
supporting
support.
structure there, so that's what that
Got it.
represents.
Okay, thank you.
Then there's one more slide in the bank, and I can either just touch base on that briefly if you want, Phil, or so.
Jump in.
As you know, part of the other bank of buildings is we are installing air conditioning. And this diagram was just put in to try to simply explain how we're accomplishing air conditioning in many of the existing classrooms. As you may recall, the unit ventilators, they look like a refrigerator-sized vertical item inside the footprint of many of the classrooms. That's what currently provides the heating only to those classrooms. So above the ceiling space of those, we can essentially introduce a cooling coil into the ductwork that feeds out over the ceiling space of the classroom, connect that to a condensing unit that's located remotely, in most cases on the roof, I believe, and that will then provide the air conditioning or the cooling component within those existing systems. So with making a fairly simple modification to the work that was done previously, we can accomplish air conditioning in most of your classrooms.
So one of the goals was, the main goal obviously was to get air conditioning in those learning spaces. Another goal was how do we do that in a cost-effective way after having those unit ventilators put in through the 2013 bond. This accomplishes it by retrofitting it and not necessarily removing them all and putting in new ones. So in some spaces, first of all, this isn't just an idea, it has actually been accomplished. We last spring put it into a southwest corner classroom and tested it, and then we went to another building and put it into another classroom and tested it. We've had balancing come in, we've had testing done. It actually is a successful program. One of the things that we wanted to make sure we were able to do is to prove the concept of what we believed could occur, and we did in fact do that through engineering. Some unit ventilators will have to come out. There'll just be some space issues in certain classrooms, but we do intend to reuse those in other classrooms. We do have some classrooms across the district that did not get new unit ventilators, so our idea would be they've got life in them. If we can't accomplish the retrofit in that classroom, we have to put a new unit ventilator in there. Let's remove the one and not trash it, but in fact, use it to the best of our ability. So I just want to give you the heads up on that as well.
They just condensed what was months of, our team just condensed what was months of dialogue, brainstorming, in an effort to contain costs as much as possible, be as judicious with the investment we had already made, and again, to try that out last spring to assure that engineering would indeed work. So they really just in the past 3 to 4 minutes condensed what was many, many months of effort with many minds working on this solution to bring to you. So it sounds relatively simple, but that page alone was certainly worth the effort that they've gone through in order to maintain the investment originally put in.
Yeah, I was going to hit on that point as well. The team members I'd mentioned before, not only French's team, UBS, the mechanical engineer, Mr. Lau's team as well, the staff that's going to be working on this, maintaining it, understanding what systems have failed in the district previously and make sure we're not repeating any of those. Those meetings it was months worth of discussions. This was not the first and only option. There were other options mechanically to do it. Some just didn't make sense from a future standpoint. Some didn't make sense from a cost standpoint. Some didn't make sense for just literally fitting in the space without having to throw away what we just did in the previous bond. So I appreciate you saying that, Andre, but it has been many, many, many months of discussion and making sure we're doing the right thing here.
It's kind of in the weeds, but, so you're essentially putting the condensing unit up on the roof, right? And it'll pull humidity out and you're gonna get some vapor. What happens to that? Does it get blown out? Does it?
No, it's just, it's oversimplifying, but it's we'll call it a residential unit. You could say if you have an air conditioning unit outside your house, inside your furnace is a coil. We're putting that coil in the supply duct above the ceiling. It'll up to the roof, your air conditioning unit will be there. There will be condensate from the coil above the ceiling in the classroom. We're capturing that through piping and discharging it through the side of the building. It will be captured above ceiling and then discharged outside.
We'll actually need, probably in many of the classrooms, a relatively small section of the roof line, the ceiling, I should say, will have to be dropped down because of this retrofit. It's a small price to pay to accomplish what we're accomplishing.
And it's a pretty small.
Yeah,
We're looking at different options of resizing coils where needed to shrink them down. It's just building by building. It's different how much space you have
It
above
just
that
depends how
ceiling.
much you have above the drop ceiling.
But it
how much
could
space
be,
you have.
and we haven't finalized yet, but it could be as simple as a ceiling pad gets replaced with some type of a profiled pan that has a little bit of depth to it. Sometimes, the test one we did, we needed 2 more inches to get what we needed. So it'll be a case by case, and we're trying to standardize as best as possible.
I think we only have a couple quick slides to finish up,
Yep.
and then we'll end this presentation.
So next up is the good old budget. Right now, we're showing what we're carrying for costs for the renovation portion. So this is the 2022 work for Project 1 only. The renovation sites totaled $13.9 million in our budget. And then the air conditioning only sites, when we put our capital plan together, it was isolated dollars that we had set aside for air conditioning. We pulled those dollars from it. The total is $7.25 million. So for the Churchill grant and all these building sites, that's just a portion of what we have set aside. The renovations still have reserved dollars that will be used later that are still held in the budget. What's not typical here is that we usually have a estimate that coincides with this budget. Going back to our condensed design schedule, we're still about a week and a half, 2 weeks away from that estimate from Clark Construction. It's not to the fault of anybody in the group. Everybody's been working pretty darn hard to get to this point. It's just, we didn't want to put something premature in front of the team here. So we can come back next month with that DD estimate to coincide with what Dale presented. It's just that, and we did have an SD estimate. We've gone through that process. We just didn't want to show numbers that weren't apples to apples from what we have on there. So right now, we're just showing budget, what we're working towards and monitoring, and we'll follow up later once we have that data. I think we got one more. Sorry, one more. Just going through a high level schedule here. So where we are today, we're moving forward to a board presentation of the DD estimate, like I just mentioned. This just maps out when we turn the year. Our design's going to wrap up. We're going to get our packages out in January, issue them for bids, and then we should be visiting you again in February following a post-bid interview process, but we'll be presenting our trade contractor bids in February for your review and hopeful approval. But working a lot of work left, I should say, from where we are in the DD phase. We had a 3.5-hour meeting today with staff looking at all the systems, and there'll be plenty more of those with building by building page turns, but working our way towards the January bid date and a February presentation to you guys. That gets into the contract issuance and then the construction and occupancy portion. The one note on this one, usually it is working with the bookends of the summer schedule. Given the complex spaces, the kitchens, the media centers, there will be some, and we're still finalizing this with Clark right now. Once again, coincides with the DD estimate and the design stage. There are areas that we will have to probably occupy into the fall. It will not hold up any classrooms. We know that the kitchens will be the biggest headache, so we're trying to prioritize that. But media centers that could become, or ways to adapt to not having a media center done on time. It's just the reality of a lot of work in a small space. It's more than a classroom. It's more than a typical footprint. There's a lot of trades in one area that we'll have to work there. The reality is that it's not something we can achieve in the 11 or 12 weeks we have for a summer, and it's not atypical. And compounding it is, if we are trying to be proactive in getting equipment and materials, but if we do have any hiccups there, there's no time to recover from that. So still trying to track those, but there's a lot of hurdles we're gonna have to get through and occupy those spaces beyond the summer.
And we've planted that seed with the Food and Nutrition Services Department, saying, you may not be there, and planted that seed with principals saying, we may not have even potentially the media center, so just want to make sure that, we just plan for that in advance.
Well, very exciting stuff. Does anyone have any comments, questions before we finish up here? No, thank you for being here, to walking us through this. It was very advantageous to have both of you guys here to assist with this. So thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to the Valentine's Day presentation. We'll bring some chocolates.
There we go.
Thank you, thank you.
Bring a date.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. All right, thank you, guys.
thank you.
Thank you.
Dale, thank you very much. I'm going to have Brian stay for
Sounds good.
the next item.
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that brings us to item 2, which is pre-purchase of HVAC equipment.
This item was alluded to earlier during the presentation, and we brought up the idea that we have been, or the fact that we've been working on this based upon what is a known long lead time to try to be proactive in the process. So in your packet, you did get information, a memo from me, and you had a letter from Plant Moran Cressa, as well as the bid results from this pre-purchase bid. We had spec'd those units that we were concerned about lead time on, and essentially, we are coming to the board with for approval, a recommendation to you for approval on the purchase of these units. LPS would essentially, in the end, turn them over to whichever contractor ends up winning the overall bid, and there'll probably be multiple contractors, and we would not be installing them. It's not like something that I usually come to you and say, we're gonna purchase this item and put it in. We need to do this simply to get the clock started on that lead time, because the manufacturers will not start manufacturing them and start that process until they have a PO from Livonia Public Schools on this. I'll turn it over to Brian. He can explain in a little more detail, but essentially, we are coming to you with this because of a proactive stance on getting the item that we believe, if we waited till February, would be too late.
Yep, thank you, Phil. Yeah, and it is summarized in a recommendation letter, exactly that. And to highlight that, to make it clear, we're asking to release 9 pieces of equipment that were identified. These are the larger air handling units started in space. In total, there's about 335 pieces of mechanical equipment we identified that will be installed next summer. We did not go for all 335, obviously. We wanted to make sure we were being responsible, not trying to take advantage. And honestly, this is a lot more labor intensive on our side to package this up, issue it as a separate package, and then make sure that we have everything put together to seamlessly hand that off to a mechanical contractor that would typically buy that. So once again, a lot of meetings, weeks and weeks of conversations to get to this point. We felt it was in the best interest of the district to release these 9 pieces of unit now.
And to protect the interests of the districts, as I mentioned, we brought in our legal counsel, Clark Hill, to work with us on this before we proceeded.
Absolutely. So just quick timeline, a typical package was released in mid-November. That was put onto the Sigma website, put into the newspapers, identifying the 9 pieces of equipment with a basis of design of a company, but it was open to all manufacturers to bid as long as they priced to meet that specification that was issued. And we made sure that, one thing, going back to Clark Hill, we cannot sole spec something. It has to be open and up to, or available to all manufacturers to bid on, and that was the goal of it. So received bids are issued on November 15th. We did receive 2 bids as summarized later in this package from Train and Thermalnetics. We receiving those 2 bids. Sorry, let me go back to page 4. Is the Clark Construction bid summary. You'll see that Train actually came in at a quite significantly lower price of $264,000, with Thermalnetics at $492,000. Upon receiving these bids, obviously it was a drastic difference. We elected to pull both firms in to interview. During the interview with Train, went through the specifications and found that they did not bid to the specifications. They had a lot of alternates in there that they chose to use as their base bid rather than meet our spec and then offer those alternates as a separate. So they could not honor their price based on what they were offering. The price was too big of a delta of what they need to offer. Competitive bidding process, we can't allow them to change their price. So we had to, they obviously had to pull their bid, and we went with Thermalnetics. That did capture the full scope.
The quick translation on that is what we spec'd was not accomplished in the bid by Train. And then after the conversation, they understood that and they had pulled out of it.
So jumping back, to page 2, we did have a breakout per school. So this goes back to what Phil was alluding to is we're going to have different packages that are bid to mechanical contractors. We want to identify the cost per building so that way we can break these pieces of equipment up, shift those costs to their scope, and it's captured when they submit their bids. So that's the breakout of each building to get to the $492,000 total that we're recommending tonight.
Quick question. Now, with, for instance, Randolph Elementary has 2 rooftop units where Kennedy has 1. Is that, they seem like, I understand Randolph might be a little bigger, but why 2 units versus 1?
It's a matter of what units have been replaced recently. Some already had air conditioning.
Yeah,
Obviously,
okay.
these units may fail at different spans, not in a bond program. So just knowing what's been upgraded previously, we're not going to go in there and tear out something that's still functioning or has life to it. So
Got it.
that's where there'd be variances out there.
When you see 2 units at Randolph, 1 unit at Kennedy, 1 unit at Hayes, those aren't all the rooftop units they have. Those are the ones that our team has said, we need to replace these at this time.
Got it, thank you. Timmy?
So this is a little bit off topic, but I know you mentioned, I think you said sole spec, right? And we can't do that. Not tonight, obviously, we're not prepared for that. But have we given a presentation lately about, just to briefly go over a couple of these things that I noticed is, what a sole spec is, what happens and why people pull out of their bids, what that means when we only have one bidder left, how do we determine, are we obligated if we have bids that we don't think are reasonable, what are our obligations, and maybe just have a presentation, since we're going back through this bond process again, just so that everybody's on the same page and the community kind of knows and understands a little bit up front, and we can have something that maybe we can, when people have questions, we can reference back to that meeting on, here's, we've gone through kind of the process and explained some of this stuff.
Yeah, we can do that. Certainly.
Absolutely. So we can include that into either a study session or a committee of the whole as we take a look at this. So we have obviously many years ahead of us with this project. And I think it's a great question because there are times when we are living and breathing this. And so it's very familiar to us. But both for the community and for the board, quite frankly, that could be helpful. And so if the board would like to identify for President Burton and myself what some of those areas would be, we'd be certainly happy to give kind of a general, 101 terminology and situational, things that we may come across in the course of the bond.
So ideally, I know you mentioned maybe doing a study session, which is great because we can really kind of, dig in. It's a little bit more informal, but I think for me, I would rather do it at one of our televised meetings where
Sure.
it's available to the public. We can reference people back if they have a lot of questions. And there's, something that we have that sort of goes through that process and what we can do, and not necessarily, well, maybe including the bidding process, but, we start throwing out terms like sole spec, right? And we understand what he means when he says it. But, but have just a little bit of a layout. So with some of the major questions that have a tendency to come up, well, why did you do that? That's not, those questions where somebody might say, that's not fair, or I don't understand what an alternate is. How is that right? And just some of those questions to make sure that everybody's on board and try and answer some of those community questions up front. And just to be as transparent as possible, I think is not, I think if we know that stuff ahead of time, it alleviates questions and concerns that may come up and grow into something like, social media where it kind of gets a life of its own.
Sure, no, I think that's a great point. In everything that we do, we try to be as transparent as possible. This one is a little bit complicated. If I made an analogy, it would be back to the last bond where we actually pre-purchased all the unit ventilators, or actually, I should say pre-priced them, where we locked pricing in for a period of time. We didn't actually buy them. We had the pricing locked in, and then the mechanical contractors actually bought them. This is very similar, where we're just kind of starting the manufacturing, ordering process, so to speak, and the shop drawings and all that. We're not actually buying the rooftop units. The mechanical contractor will buy them later. But anytime we get down a path like this where it's out of the norm, the first thing we do is pick up the phone and call legal counsel and walk them through what we think we want to do and make sure that it meets, all the state laws and guidelines and meets your board policies and procurement policies. So it does get a little bit complicated sometimes, but we always want to make sure that we're being transparent in how we do things. So that's a great point.
So, Mr. Weber, Mr. Taro, is that something you think that we can put together, just a general,
Sure.
Bond construction 101 with some of that terminology over the next couple of months that we can bring to the board and the community?
Yep.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, thank you.
And I would request this to go on the regular voting meeting? Thank you.
And that's for next week. right?
Next week we have that, right? Yeah.
All right, that concludes building and site. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Have a good
Paul.
evening.
And thank you, Brian.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Brian.
Paul,
Thank
for
you,
coming
Paul.
out. And Dale, thank you.
Thank you, Dale.
Appreciate your time and the input. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention that Mr. Willenberg did follow up on the question you had about the press boxes, and they do indeed have Wi-Fi.
Oh, thank you. That was very quick. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Willenberg. The next item on our agenda is our Finance Committee, item 4, and I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Bonifield.
Thank you, President Burton. We have 2 items for Finance Committee tonight. The first one is the budget amendment, and Mrs. Smith will be assisting us with that.
Thank you, everybody. First, I'd like to give a big thank you to Miss Stacy Jenkins, who has helped me revamp the budget book cover page. We've brought some new life to it, so hopefully, yeah, we can carry that energy through as we go. First, before we dig into the details, just a reminder, I know the board knows this, but more for our community at home, we do quarterly financial updates, and they either take the form of a formal budget amendment or an informal update. So we last had an update in October, and that was paired with our review of our financial statements, and we were joined by the auditors to walk through the financial statements, and we also had a chance to do our comparison of our actual expenditures last year compared to the budget. So now, up on our radar is another financial update for you, and it'll take the form of a budget amendment. So then next, we'll get together in March for typically an informal update, and then a final amendment come June. So I'll start with the general fund, and again, before I dig in, I thought I'd kind of cut to the chase and let you know the bottom line. I'm recommending an increase to our revenues totaling $2.4 million and a reduction in expenditures of $1.7 million, which would leave us with an ending fund balance of $30.4 million or 19.3%. And those are big numbers we're talking about, so I always do like to put it in perspective. The Michigan School Business Officials recommends a fund balance of 15 to 20%, so that ending fund balance puts us right in that target zone. So with that, I will dig into the book. The first page is our general fund revenue. So we've really, we have about 69 different line items within our general fund revenue, and there was lots of adjustments within those 69 lines, but it really boils down to 2 main adjustments. The first being an increase in our 147C revenue from the state. And if you'll recall, the 147C revenue is related to the MIPSR's retirement costs, and it is given to school districts But then those payments flow right back to the state, to another department, the Office of Retirement Services. So when we get to the expenditures, we'll see we also have an increase in our retirement costs there that's related to this additional 147C revenue. So in total, that was $2 million of additional 147C revenue, so rather significant. I am guessing the reason that we're seeing so much of that is because we do still maintain so much of our staff in-house. We don't outsource, and so I think as a whole, when you look across the state, that impacts the share that we get of the 147C revenue, because that's based on your prior year payrolls. The other big adjustment in the general fund revenue is new to our district, a first-time reimbursement from Wayne Risa. As you'll recall, when we were looking at the Wayne Risa proposed budget that was needed to be reviewed by our board before it could go to the Wayne Risa board, we do notice that they have a nice fund balance in their special education fund, and they've been really receptive to working with districts to try to help alleviate some of the pressures that we are feeling on our general fund. And so a number of years ago, they started a reimbursement for our unreimbursed special education transportation costs. So every year we submit to the state what our special ed transportation costs were for the prior year. And currently under state aid, we get a 70% reimbursement. And so a number of years ago, again, Wayne Risa started reimbursing us for some of those unreimbursed costs. They've now are going to give, we haven't received it yet, an additional reimbursement for unreimbursed general fund special education costs. So a little background there. We spend roughly $30 million a year in special education programs. Half of that is Act 18 programs. Those Act 18 programs are fully reimbursed between the money that we get from the state and money that we get from Wayne Risa. Wayne Risa gets the funds because they levy a special education millage. And then on the general fund side, we have about $15 million worth of special education costs. And right now, through state aid, about 30% of those costs get reimbursed from the state. So that leaves 70% of those general fund special education costs that just come out of our general fund pot. And so RISA is proposing to reimburse us for a portion of those unreimbursed costs. For us, that's going to be about $400,000. So something that we've learned of after our proposed budget was adopted, but something we're happy to add. So again, we haven't received that yet, but that was Wayne Risa's estimate when they shared that news with us. The other item I'd like to make note for the budget is also a reclassification of some revenues from the other financing sources up to local. You can see it looks like the other financing sources has dropped quite a bit, and that really isn't the case. It's actually just putting that up in the local line. And what that is our payments from Wayne Risa. We already were accounting for the Wayne County Enhancement Millage in local revenue, but our reimbursements, like for the special ed transportation costs and for the Independence Parapro program, those were done in other financing sources, but really the more appropriate spot would be for it to be in local. So that's the change there. Yes?
I'm sorry, Allison. Mrs. Burton had a question.
Sure, thank you. The $400,000 that we're anticipating that RISA is going to be contributing, is that based on a percentage of our costs?
It is.
And what is that?
And actually, I can get the letter exactly what it was. I think it was.
Ballpark.
I thought it was 3% of our unreimbursed special education costs.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
And as you know, as Mrs. Smith shared, that's about a little over $10 million a year that we pull out of our general fund to provide our special education services,
Okay.
unreimbursed.
So with that, I'll move on to the expenditures. On the expenditure side, as I mentioned, we have overall, I'm proposing a reduction of expenditures of $1.7 million. And I'll explain why. First is the UAAL retirement costs that I just mentioned. Again, we're getting additional revenue for that, but we also now have to expense retirement costs. So you'll see adjustments on practically every single line. Any line that contains salaries now will have that adjustment for the additional retirement costs. One offset we have is a school bus purchase, and I'll explain. So how we come up with our proposed budget is it's typically a roll forward of what the expenditures were from the prior year. We assume we're going to still have the same staff in place and run the same programs. And then we'll go through and make adjustments for things that we know that are going to be different. And I brought that little sheet from our proposed budget to just potentially jog your memory. So we know, for instance, that retirement rate was going to go up. We knew that the health insurance was going to go up. We knew we'd have some savings from retirements, and we knew we had some step increases, so we factored that into our budget. One thing that I didn't factor in, which I should have, was a school bus purchase that we made in 2021. So that purchase, the budget for it came through to 21-22, but now that the 2020 bond has passed, we do not need to use general fund dollars for that school bus purchase, so we'll be using the dollars from the bond. So that was a line item that I could reduce and I got to eliminate. So that was kind of nice because it practically offset the cost of those additional retirement costs, which was worked out well. The other big adjustment that I wanted to make note of was in the top 3 lines, you'll see basic programs, added needs, and pupil support, and I'll explain what's included in each one of those. Basic programs are your basic classroom teachers and teaching supplies. That would be specials teachers. Again, the name kind of says it, the basic programs we operate. The next line down is added needs, and those would be costs such as resource room teachers, that would be our elementary support teachers, our voc ed teachers, as well as, I'm thinking EL teachers would be in that category. And then the next line down is pupil support. The biggest cost in that category would be our counselors and our student assistance providers. So when you look at those first 3 categories, in total it looks like our spending has gone down by $1.6 million, but it really hasn't. We've been fortunate enough to get some additional grant dollars that are picking up the cost of those staff, so we are shifting them out of the general fund and over to our funded projects fund. So that's the other main adjustment we see here in the general fund. So when we factor in the adjustments for the revenue and then the adjustments on the expenditure side, again, we're looking at an ending fund balance of about $30.4 million or 19.3%. So I will make note that that's a continued planned use of our fund balance. As you know, our starting fund balance this year, if I flip back to the other page, was just under $33.1 million, and we're looking at a 30.4. So we are, again, planning to use a portion of our fund balance for the programs that we're operating today. And I'll stop because I know that's a lot of information on that page and that I shared, so I'll see if anybody's got any questions before I move on.
Questions, guys? Anything, we're good? Okay.
Okay, wonderful. On the next page is the grants that we were just talking about, our funded projects fund. And there were just a few things I wanted to take a minute to update you on. First off was just our federal funds. I know that's been on everybody's radar. We've been fortunate enough to get a few different grants, the ESSER Grant 1, ESSER Grant 2, and now we're in the process of applying for an ESSER Grant 3. As well as some per pupil equalization grants. So that's the first one that I'll start with. It's under state sources because it's actually coming to us from the state, and a little bit of background. For both ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, the state passed some legislation that for ESSER 2, any district that wasn't getting at least $450 per pupil from ESSER 2, they would make up the difference for you and pay that to us. And so that came to us last year. That was Section 11R. And they also did something similar for ESSER 3. They said if your ESSER 3 allocation from the federal government isn't at least $1,093, we'll again make you whole for that. So for us, that works out to just over $5 million. So I've included that here in the budget. That's been the estimate that's been shared with us by the state. But I did want to mention those funds haven't been received. And in fact, the grant application hasn't even been released yet. I think they have their hands full with the ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. So the last update I got in mid-November was that they were planning to have the application out in the next 6 weeks. So I'm assuming sometime in January we'll have that.
I'm just going to jump in just with a related topic to that. As we talk about these grant funds, as you know, we recently surveyed our school community, our parent community, our staff, and our high school students. to garner input on the ESSERS 3 grant that we will be applying for by December 15th. Then there's also this 11T money, which is the equalization payment, which again, that application has yet to come out, so we will complete that as well. And I just want to take a moment, we received about 2,100 responses, including about 500 free write responses. And so we appreciate the feedback that we were given, and we're in the process of culling that data together and utilizing that as part of our application. So these are not dollars that are just put into our fund in the district. We have to apply for them. We have to be granted those funds. We have to expend the funds and then ask for reimbursement. So these are not automatic dollars. And I just want to be certain, and there are very, very prescribed areas and purposes for which we can use these dollars. So both from a federal level and a state level, that guidance is very clear. But we appreciate the feedback that we received and the many, many people that took time to fill out that survey. So that was helpful information, and certainly information we will use in our application for both ESSERS 3 as well as the 11T when that application comes out. So we'll keep you posted on that. But again, those are not dollars that will automatically be put into our state aid payment. We'll have to, again, apply, be granted, and then expend the funds and ask for reimbursement.
Just to jump on that too, we've been forewarned by, the state that these funds will be audited, so be, prepared for that. And that brings me, comfort as a taxpayer, knowing that the funds are going to be spent the way that they were intended to be spent. And that's not just for Livonia Public Schools, that's for anybody receiving these dollars. And we know that's the case because we just were visited by our external auditors this summer, and they, in fact, did choose ESSER 1 grant and our coronavirus relief fund, and they audited those, and of course, they came out perfect, no findings there. So, again, I share that because as taxpayers, I know we want to make sure that our funds are being spent appropriately, and that's an extra level of assurance that they are. Carrying on with those federal grants, I did want to mention, as we look down at federal sources, about the fifth one down, ESSER 1 was fully expended as of June 30th last year, so that's been completely spent. The other federal grant I wanted to point out to you was about 2/3 of the way down, the Section 11P coronavirus relief funds. We spent about $2.6 million of that last year, which leaves about $2.2 million for us to use this year, and that too has been fully spent. There was a deadline on that grant to be spent by December 30th, 31st, or 30? I should know how many days are in December, but
31.
Thank you, 31. So those grant dollars have been fully expended this year as well. And then not related to the pandemic, but still on the federal grant side, I did want to make mention of our IDA grant, that we've gotten a pretty significant increase in the funding, about $1.1 million of additional, if I've done my math right, additional IDA dollars. So again, when we look at the general fund and we see that decrease in the added needs costs, again, those expenses haven't gone away. They've just shifted over here, and we've been able to use IDA funds to cover those costs. So some good news on the grant fund.
Any questions for Mrs. Smith?
No.
Mrs. Smith, I think one of the things that we maybe assume all the time is that all these funds are just coming to us. Is there any way that you might be able to highlight in maybe one slide?
Sure.
Just the money that we have had to ask for, the money that we've applied for, that's not just because we have a certain number grants, ESSERs that we've had to apply for, things that have taken our time and effort, and just to clarify the amount of time and effort that goes into making sure that we have taken advantage of all those dollars that are out there. And I think it would be really interesting for me to see how many of those dollars we actually have had to make applications for. I know we had the bus money a few years ago, and some different things, and that I think it's really prudent to point out that we're continually working very hard to find as much money as we possibly can. And just to clarify that just because the media has all this information out there about ESSERs and stuff like that, make it clear that we're not just sitting back and,
Yep.
that didn't work very well, collecting those dollars, that this is an ongoing, critical job that we're doing here, and making sure that we're taking advantage of all of this that's available.
Yeah, I would be happy to include that. And even, it's interesting because as I look down at the grants, I can't think of actually a single one on the page that it didn't actually involve an application process. There really are, we've got the competitive grants, like you were mentioning, that aren't just allocated to the district that we have to go out and pursue and track down and hunt for. And then there's ones that are formula-based. A formula-based one would be, for example, IDA. That's based on our special education count. Title I would be another formula grant, but it would definitely, 31A, thank you. But those are definitely, like the Title I grant is probably something that takes at least a month to complete those applications, and it's our office working closely with the Academic Services Office, who also then work closely with our principals to come up with recommended use of those funds, and then those all go to the state, and they have to get pre-approved before we can even spend $1 out of them. So again, it's kind of a nice assurance for taxpayers to know that there's a lot of checks and balances to make sure that the funds are being used appropriately.
And now that you're in the middle of talking about it, I think the other thing is that just to be really clear that, it seems like we have this huge budget, and we get asked a lot of times, why can't we do this or why can't we do that? But also to be really clear that, here are the millions of dollars that we have gone after and made sure that we're getting the appropriate dollars and taking advantages of those. However, that percentage of our budget is not, is highly prescripted, would be the right, and that those aren't just dollars that they're like, hey, toss them at the general fund and we can go, woo, we can do whatever we want with them. That those are very clear uses for those. And, that's why if, they're special education dollars, they go to special education. That's what they're meant for. If they're for the buses, they're for the buses, and why, we have to use those dollars. And not to say that we would choose to use those dollars any differently, but just to really drive home the point that it's not as easy as just getting money in and spending money, and, maybe we use it for this today, or maybe we use it for that tomorrow. That we get the money in, we have to use it specifically, it goes out, and yes, we may have a huge budget, but when we say we can't fund something, it's not necessarily because we don't have enough money, it's that we don't have money to fill those buckets.
Yep, that's accurate, yep. Thank you. I will take us to the next page. If no more questions on the grants, the next budget that we're looking at is our special education fund. And there was a couple items that I wanted to point out for you. The first one was our beginning fund balance in the special education fund, which is just under 2.8. I did want to mention part of that is due to some revenue that we received in 2021 that actually was not earned, that we'll have to pay back this year, and I'll take a minute to explain that. So our special education fund is our Act 18 programs. This is where the finances are recorded. And Wayne Risa pays us based on a payment schedule. So based on estimated expenditures, they'll make payments, and then we submit actual cost reports, and then we true it up. And if they've overpaid us, then we have to pay that money back. They end up just reducing it out of the next year's budget. So I did want to mention that that we were overpaid by $700,000, so that is coming back out of our budget this coming year. So that was one thing I wanted to make note of. And the other one was really a discussion point with the board, and it's regarding the third line you see down under expenditures, and that's transfers to other funds, and I'm proposing an additional transfer. So as you probably already know, the county pays us indirect costs for operating the Act 18 program. They realize that it takes time in the business office to run the payrolls for our Act 18 folks. It takes time in the HR office to hire people. Also, thinking of our buildings, obviously there's a cost to running those classrooms and whatnot. So they reimburse districts for indirect cost. So what I'm proposing to do this year, in light of where our fund balance is, and this is part of the reason that we grew that, fund balance, and we don't just keep it at zero, is to do a transfer, not only continue the transfer to our general fund for indirect costs that our general fund is incurring, but also to do a transfer to our capital projects fund, because part of the fund, why we had some savings there, was to address if we had facility needs for our Act 18 programs that were beyond what the Act 18 program would cover. And we know, as we looked at our 2020 bond, is it 2021 bond? Was it 2020? I think I'm losing time of, 2021. We know that the needs, exceeded what we asked of our community. We had at the time identified about $197 million worth of needs, and we asked for about $186 million. So what I'm proposing is setting some of these funds aside in our capital projects fund, so that as we get to those building renovations where Act 18 programs are being housed, that maybe there would be certain things that we would like to do that may be beyond the scope of a normal, bond renovation, but might be a little above and beyond, but might be a really nice addition for our programs, that we would then have that flexibility to do that. So I wanted to mention that to you. That's not something that we had done before. Again, that was kind of what the intended purpose of those funds were, but this maybe kind of clearly lays it out for our community. So I wanted to see if the board would be receptive to that, or, okay, sounds like you are. Sounds good. Wonderful. With that, I'll take us to our next page. Probably one of the more boring funds is our debt retirement fund, but we do appreciate it because this means this is here because we've had successful bond passages. And again, I do want to take a minute to thank our community. We are so fortunate in Livonia that we have the support of our community when we do go and request things such as a bond, so that we can renovate our facilities, purchase technology, get new buses. I know other school districts are not that fortunate, so it's not something that we take for granted. I know the board doesn't take that for granted, so I thank you for that. What our bond fund does, when we pass the bond, obviously we get the money up front, and then we have to pay it back over time. So what this fund does is account for the bonds that we have outstanding. Our 2013 bond, Series 1 and 2, our 2014 refunding bond, the 2020 refunding bond, and our latest, the 2021 bond, Series 1. So nothing, again, no big changes right there. Moving on to our capital projects fund. So these are the funds that are funded out of those debt retirement funds. So the first is our 2013 bond. Really the only thing of note here is the higher beginning fund balance. I was hopeful that we would have spent more of it by this past June 30th. We had a little bit more left as of June 30th. So I've updated the beginning fund balance and then placed those additional funds into the expenditure line. So again, I'm hopeful, and I'm working with my colleagues to get those funds used by the end of this school year. The next bond is our 2020 bond. Only a couple of changes on there. Again, I updated the beginning fund balance. Sadly, interest income I've cut in half. The interest market has not been very favorable to us, unfortunately. We were very fortunate with the last bond to have earned about $1.5 million in interest. That doesn't look like that's going to be the case. We are working with our financial advisor, PFM, to try to get as much interest as possible, but it doesn't look like it'll be anywhere in the neighborhood of what we were able to do this last bond. And again, that kind of goes back to, it's a assurance for our taxpayers that school districts aren't putting their funds into risky investments. They're very secure investments, but then that means that we've got pretty low returns. The other update was to expenditures. I've worked closely with Brian Weber on our cash flows, and although this isn't a cash flow, this budget more aligns with what I think will actually be spent by June 30th. And then I'll move on to the next fund. We've got two more capital projects fund. The first is our sinking fund. The change on here is just an update to the beginning fund balance. And we also had a number of projects that were started last year that didn't finish until the beginning of the school year, so I've adjusted the expenditures accordingly. And then our one below that is our capital projects fund. This is the one that is established by board policy, and this is the board policy that says if our fund balance is above 15%, above the MSBO recommended range, that any sale of property will be put into the capital projects fund. And I believe the intent at the time was to recognize that sale of property is one-time in nature, and we don't want to build recurring general fund expenditures based on one-time revenues. So it was the hope to align one-time revenues with one-time expenditures, and so that's what prompted this capital projects fund. I'm so happy to share, and you guys can see our latest use of these funds was here on the in the board office, and we're so grateful every day coming to work. It's beautiful. So I thank the board and I thank our community for that. I'd also like to say thank you to Tony and Melissa, who've done such a wonderful job keeping up these facilities. They've had some additional responsibilities now with the upgrades, and they've just done a fantastic job. So thank you to them. Yes, Ms. Burton?
Just one thing too, regarding the capital projects fund, that historically goes back some decades, and has always been for capital projects, that anytime we have a sale of property, it was to go into capital projects. The only time that, to my knowledge, that actually got a little bit of a reprieve to use any of that into general fund was when we went through the recession and the fund balance got to be so dangerously low. So it was within this last 10 years.
Yes.
That we made that adjustment to our policy, saying that if our fund balance was so much lower, we could use it for capital projects. I mean, for rather, general fund, did not have to. But the design and the purpose for this all along has been so that sale of property goes into capital projects fund. And it was just a small snippet of time when it was allowed to be used into general funds, not the other way around.
Thank you for that history. I didn't know, how long it had been around, so that does make a lot of sense. Yeah. And to your point, too, about the fund balance, it was not too long ago, it was 2014, that we had a either 3 or 2.6% fund balance. And again, for folks at home that don't live and breathe it, anything under 5% is considered early warning district of financial distress. So we were definitely in a position to need to find any funds that we could.
Right. So it was really that, only for that small window, and Mrs. Oquist has been around for that entire period of time, that we've altered board policy to make any reprieve on that at all. But it's always been intended, and I'm glad that we're back in a position where we're in solid enough financial footing so that we can go back to its original purpose, which is one-time expenditure, or one-time rather income from sale of property goes into capital projects.
Thank you. Another one thing I almost missed, we just talked about in the special education fund, so you will see in this fund the proposed transfer I'm recommending from our special education fund, again, to address facility needs as we work through the 2021 bond for potentially doing some additional work at our Act 18 locations. We're in the final stretch, just a couple funds left. Food service, this one actually, I did want to take a minute and talk about food service. You'll notice pretty sizable increase on the federal reimbursement side. As you know, we are participating in the unanticipated school closure grant, and long story short, that means free meals for all. And so based on the revenue that I've seen come in over the last few months, I am anticipating a rather large increase in that federal reimbursement. So that's a great news, because as you recall, it was just a few months ago, we had to do a transfer from our general fund to cover the costs in our food service fund. So this is really welcome news. Along with the additional federal reimbursement, we are seeing additional food costs, as we're seeing all over, and as folks can see when they go to the grocery store. So those things haven't missed our district. So I'm also proposing the approval of some additional expenditures in our food service fund, but still, looking at a much better ending fund balance, just under $800,000 in the food service fund. And that puts us really more in line with where we were pre-pandemic. And the thing about the food service fund balance is nice, is because that can then go into program improvements. So if we need to buy new ovens, this could be a source of funds. And we know through the bond, we're planning to renovate our kitchens. This could be, potentially a source of buying some of that new equipment. So it's nice to see that shift.
And Mrs. Smith, do I remember correctly that food service fund can only be used for food service items?
That's correct. These are restricted.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
The only thing, and you'll see it's budgeted for like other federal programs, they do reimburse for some indirect costs. So I've included in the budget a $200,000 transfer from the food service to the general fund to cover indirect costs that the general fund incurs on behalf of the food service program.
Okay.
So that's the only transfer. Everything else is restricted and must be used on those food service program items.
Thank you.
Next is the Health and Welfare Fund. Just a little history on that, because most people probably wouldn't know that, at one point, the district was self-funded for both health insurance and workers' compensation. A number of years ago, I want to say at least 5 years ago, we did move to a fully insured medical plan. So that took away some of our risks that we would feel. But we still are self-insured for our workers' compensation. So we still maintain this separate fund and keep a fund balance over here because of being self-insured for workers' comp. So again, if somebody were to be injured on the job, this would be the fund that would cover that. We also do purchase an excess policy so that if the workers' comp claim does reach a certain point, then anything above that would be covered by the insurance company. But that's the reason why the school district maintains that separate health and welfare fund. So not too much of a change other than I'm still taking into account, open enrollment and changes from that. And we also have seen, we know that the hard cap increase is going into effect for January. So I've taken account of that, but this is really kind of aligning them more in line with what the expenditures were last year. And then also, again, like I said, taking into consideration the Januaries we're going to see come January. So, which takes us to our last page. On the last page, we have two funds. The first is our scholarship fund. So these are two restricted funds. These aren't funds that are generated by taxpayers. These are funds that were donated by individuals to form a scholarship. So we have the separate account that we keep to keep track of those things to make sure they're not commingled with any of our general fund dollars. But they're maintained here in the separate fund. So we have, this past year gotten an increase in the donations. So you'll see an increase on the revenues as well as an increase on the expenditures that go out as a form of scholarship to our seniors. And then the last but not least is our school activities fund, kind of rather not used a ton. I'll say it for this purpose of the special revenue fund. They're used a ton by our buildings, but this was a new GASB that was passed just a couple years ago that required us to treat this as a special revenue fund. And these are not funds from the taxpayers, but these would be funds that were raised by the school through doing fundraisers or maybe through a school dance, different things like that. They get deposited here and then they get used for those intended purposes. So that's the last program, and again, making an adjustment to revenue and expenditures based on last year's activity. So that is all I have for you. I'm trying to think if I've got any other general comments. I've made note, Ms. Bonifield, about having that slide for, the grants and being able to do some more breakdown there. But if it is all right with you and that looks acceptable to you, I'd ask that be added to the agenda for next week's regular voting meeting.
Yes. Works for me.
Yep, got it.
And the next one, I promise, will be much briefer.
Thank you, Mrs. Smith. If you could cover the summer tax resolution, that'd be fabulous.
Thank you. So this is a
Yes. Superintendent Elquist.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to take a moment and, as Mrs. Smith has gone through this, as you know, her involvement in this is extensive, as is that of her team. So she has truly done a tremendous job. And in the midst of this, we did have one of her key right-hand folks who had taken a position at RISA. And so Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Sofer, and members of their team have really done double and triple time. So I just want to acknowledge when we talk about the many, many dozens of line items and the detail of this budget, this is a high-level summary of that. But the work that goes into getting us to this point for our first budget amendment, and then the update in March, and then the final budget amendment in June is extensive. And I have tremendous confidence in her work and the work of her team. She is not only extraordinarily knowledgeable, she is a deep thinker about the programs and services that we offer, involves her colleagues in in those processes to truly understand the focus of these dollars and how they can benefit our students, our staff, and our schools. So I just want to take a moment and thank her for her efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Smith.
Thank you. Thank you. The next item I have for you is our summer tax resolution, and this is a request to just keep with our current practice. So as you know, we levy our mills 50% in the summertime and 50% in the wintertime. That isn't the case for all schools. Some choose to do 100% winter levy, but for quite a long time, it's been split 50-50. So I'm proposing that we continue that practice. So with your approval, I'll ask that that go on the agenda for next week. I did look back last year, it was on consent, so if you'd like to add it on consent,
Yes,
that would work.
absolutely.
Wonderful, thank you.
Any questions?
Nope.
All right, that concludes finance.
Wonderful, thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. And I will turn the meeting over to item 5, Curriculum Committee, and it's turned over to Mrs. Acosta.
Thank you, President Burton. Item 5A is Michigan school grades, and we will have Mrs. O'Brien presenting.
Thank you, Mrs. Acosta. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I am asking for a few minutes this evening just to share with you our state of Michigan school grades. So as you know, there are 2 accountability measures that our state has in place for our schools. There is the parent dashboard, which presents different sections on achievement, progress, very many of the same things that are in our grades. And then 2 years ago, they added a second accountability measure where we have a type of a report card for every school. It is not a district average, but every school can be looked up on the My School Data site, and you can look at these 2 accountability measures. The school grades were updated last month, and I wanted to just kind of give you a little summary of where we're at and what each one of the sections are. So I passed out to you just some district averages, and I have it laid out just like what the page of the report card looks like, and I gave you a sample of a school on the back just so that you could see that. The first section is proficiency grades, and so that is the rate of students reaching proficiency on our state math and reading assessments. And so those are each one of our elementary and secondary schools' overall grades for proficiency. To the right of that is our growth grades. So this year there were not growth grades for elementary school because there was no testing for 3rd graders in 1920. So last year's students who were in 4th grade did not have a previous year's test. It was their first year taking our state assessment. So those averages that I have listed there for you are just for our upper elementaries and our secondary schools grades. The second row is our graduation rates, and the state reports the highest rate among our 4, 5, or 6-year graduation rates as defined as the percentage of students graduating with a high school diploma. For all 3 of our high schools, our 5-year graduation rate was the highest, and our ranges were from 95.81% to 99.11%. Our English learner progress is based on our students who are proficient or making progress towards proficiency on our English language proficiency assessment. 3 schools had enough students to report data for that section, and those 3 schools are listed. And as you know, our high school is where we have our newcomers group, and that actually had the lowest proficiency because that's where our students at the secondary level come for English class when they're new to our country. So they have the longest way to go at our high school program. And so that's our range there for proficiency or making progress towards proficiency. So from 18.75 to 63.89%. I'll pause and ask any questions before I go on. Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you. Would you explain the difference between 4.5 and year 6 graduation rate?
Yes, so that is students who receive their diploma in 5 years. So with the additional time beyond the 4th year, our highest percent of students finish up in that 5th year. So the state reports it as which one of those 4, 5, or 6 do you have the highest rate, and then they report that rate in your grade.
Does that also include students who take high school level courses when they're in middle school?
I do not believe so, because the middle school, high school courses feed into, so if I take them in middle school, they apply to my 4-year high school diploma. So they fit into my high school credits that I need. So those students, it applies to their high school.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to finish the last 4 sections of the report card. So performance among peers. So a comparison represents how close the school's proficiency rate is from its peers' average proficiency. We've talked about peer ratings before. If you look at the sample school on the back, there's a small box, and it's just a printed version of that, right? So it's a live link, but every one of our schools has a set of peer schools that the state has listed as a comparison. And so it's based on the number of students with disabilities, and students receiving free lunch, and who are in a similar environment, meaning urban, suburban environment. So one thing to note, like one of our schools, so I clicked on many of the schools' peer groups, like our Japanese magnet school, Nijiro, one of their peer schools listed by the state of Michigan is Webster. So similar demographics according to what the state has pulled. Nijiro, one of their comparisons is to Webster, where we know that's where our academic gifted and talented students are, which is, our Japanese school is not pulling students that are similar to Webster. So that was just an example. But it is an area, since we've had these accountability measures, that we've been looking at, because as you can see, our proficiency grades and our comparison to our peers are not always the same. Then to the right of that, so the subgroup performance, this is a comparison of a school's student subgroup proficiency to the statewide corresponding subgroup proficiency. So at first, all of our schools, and again, if you look at the sample school on the back, all of our schools are listed as significantly above average. And when I dug in deeper to each one of our schools, this gradient that they have there, it has 1 through 3, and all of our schools were 1 or not applicable. Not one had a subgroup that was different from that. So I dug a little bit deeper, because I actually thought that this was one of the areas of the report card that did not get updated this year. But it actually did. But what their comparison is, and let me read exactly how it's stated. So all students who have, all schools that have a value of 1 mean that they are close to or above the state average for student subgroup performance. So if I'm my academically disadvantaged students at my school, it's compared to the state's average for that subgroup. So all of our schools are significantly above average to the state average. So that's not a peer-to-peer, that's just to the state average. So all of our schools, if they had 30 students or more, had a 1, which is at or above the state average, and the other subgroups that a school had were not NA on every single one of our schools.
Mr. Centers?
So you're saying that you're comparing the subgroups to the state. Are you talking about others, like subgroups in the state, or just the generic state data, the aggregate?
It says compared with statewide subgroup proficiency. So yes,
Yeah,
the
okay.
subgroup to
Got it.
subgroup comparison,
All right, thank you.
correct. And the last two sections were our attendance rate. So the rate of students attending 90% of possible school days. And as you look at our range, and last year we reported every month what our attendance rate was. This range fits what we presented every month last year. And to the right of that is our assessment participation rates. So this is for last year, so this is for the 2021 school year. And the rate of students participating in strictly our state math and ELA assessments, so not science or social studies. And that's our range of percent assessment participation for our elementary and our secondary schools.
You can see that's considerably lower than normal.
Correct.
Mr. Centers?
Yeah, so one thing, I was just looking through the elementary data, and if you look at attendance, you put a range here, 86 to 99, but seems to be a real outlier in Nijiiro, and I think that's because it's such a unique program. A lot of students are Japanese, they travel back and forth, they go vacation back in Japan, and I think that probably counts for a lot of it, because I look at other schools and it's, 97, 98.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So I just wanted to make you aware, since it's on our public My School data, and it was just updated just before Thanksgiving, and so I wanted to take a minute and just share with you where we're at and what our data is.
So can I guess,
Sure.
looking at all of this, right, how does this reporting impact our PLCs, or how we're moving forward to address some of these inconsistencies, I guess, for lack of a better term?
So at the school level, right, so our proficiency grades, those are our M-STEP results. We talk about those at our building level all the time. We talk about our growth grade, our growth percentage of how our students are doing from third to fourth, from fourth to fifth throughout the district. It's that performance against peers that is a conversation typically at the building level, where they might pull their school improvement team and have some conversation about, how that, when we look at our score, if I'm a given school, and then what are those schools, and how do we dig into, when I was a school principal, who those schools were, what their scores are. Did I feel like we were a good match in peer groups, and have conversation about what we need to do to continue to grow in the area of our state assessments, so that our students are performing at higher rates.
And I will say this year, certainly some individual year-over-year data makes a lot of sense to look at. I think we've said across the state that there's a concern about overemphasis on looking at these scores in aggregate because of the lack of participation. Normally, we're required to have over 95% participation in order to meet one of the school accountability requirements. When you look at the level of participation in comparison to that, we were missing a significant portion, up to a third in some schools. So there is a bit of concern about a significant course correction based on looking at this data from a district perspective, or even a school-wide perspective. The value can come when you're looking at a student's performance year over year. And so that's an important data point, in addition to their iReady assessment, benchmark assessments, common assessments that we look at. But this year in particular, we're looking at this data a little bit differently than we might have in years past, with that cautionary eye that, again, we were missing a significant block of our students, which impacted this data not just in Livonia, but across our state.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you.
This concludes curriculum.
All righty, that brings us to policy. Item 6, Mr. Johnson.
I don't believe we have anything, Mrs. Oquist.
We do not. We will have some for you in June, well, we might have some
I
in
hope it's
June,
not that
but we will
long.
definitely have some in
It's been
January.
busy, yeah.
Yes.
All righty. Item 7, personnel. Mrs. Bradford is absent this evening. I don't believe we have any items, Mrs.
We do
Opus? Okay. And item 8, legislative. Mrs. Jarvis?
We have nothing.
Okay.
We do not.
All righty. We've come to the end of our meeting this evening. Thank you to those who've hung in with us, and thank you, as always, to our cabinet team who's supported us and given us all the information that we need on a regular basis. Thank you very much. We are now adjourned.